My name is Tiberius, a soldier of the Roman Empire. Greetings to you. I am here to speak about a man that changed my life. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But right now, I want to talk about a man that received a wrongful conviction, a man that I myself have crucified with these hands. You know, in the beginning, I had heard much about this man. He was noted for his teachings, his miracles, and his reputation as a man of integrity. As I said, I am a soldier. Jerusalem was my home for a very short 2 years. I am from what you know as today as Italy, and I was born about a 5-hour chariot ride from Rome. As my father was a Roman soldier, so too am I a Roman soldier. My first posting was to the northern region of the Roman Empire. Times were very difficult there, especially during the winter season, because I was not accustomed to the cold. I was more accustomed to the southern climes of Italy. After I had served 3 years in the northern region, I asked to be transferred to a somewhat warmer climate. And you really don't get a choice in the Roman Empire as to where you go, but they picked for me the Jewish region centered around Jerusalem. No soldier in their right mind would want to go to that area. It's just desert, and there's nothing really going on over there. It's just dead space. But it was warmer, so I didn't mind, although it wasn't an ideal place. When I had first heard of this man, Jesus, I was told that he was a prophet. And I didn't even know what a prophet was when I first heard this. I also heard that he had performed a number of miracles. And I used to joke with my fellow soldiers. I used to say, if this man really is a man of miracles, I wish he could send me to Rome somehow. I really didn't understand who this man really was. Some of the things I'm going to tell you, I will tell you as a first-person witness. In other words, I actually saw them happening right before me. I was part of the story. I was part of the activities of his crucifixion. I've seen things with my own eyes. The other things that I'm going to say come from some of my friends and associates who were themselves first-person witnesses, and they can attest to what they had seen through me. My first interaction with Jesus came at the hands of, and I'll say it in Latin in my own language, Marcus Pontius Pilatus, or as you know him, Pontius Pilate, the 5th Roman governor of the Roman province of Judea. But let me go back to the time when he was first arrested. And I get this from my associates and my friends, because I didn't see this firsthand, but what they told me was that the Pharisees were out to get him for quite some time. They were trying to find a way to kill him, and they tried this beforehand and failed. When Jesus rode into Jerusalem a week before his death, he came in like a triumphant king, and the Pharisees were appalled. They couldn't believe what was going on. He went to their temple, and Jesus drove out many of the merchants there because they were known to cheat people who needed to buy sacrifices for their sins. Then he preached in the temple, and the people just held on to every single word he said. The Pharisees were infuriated with what they heard. They were infuriated with Jesus, and they wanted him dead. Well, the Pharisees were so intent on killing Jesus that they spoke to one of his closest followers, one of his 12 disciples. His name, of course, Judas of Iscariot. And they promised him 30 pieces of silver if he would give him up, if he would point him out to him and have them take care of the rest. Well, Judas found him, and he was intent on kissing Jesus, so that he would be pointed out. But before Judas could kiss him, Jesus said, "What is it that you all want?" And they said, "Well, we're looking for Jesus Christ." And he said, "I am he." And as soon as they heard those words, they stepped back and they fell down, which attests to the power of his words, of this man that At the time, I didn't understand at all. But as I will tell you in more detail a little bit later on, I do understand now. Well, they took him into custody, and Jesus had pointed out to Peter some time before that Peter would disown him 3 times. And Peter denied this, of course. He said, I would never disown you. I would go to jail. I would go to prison. I would go to any length to protect you. But Jesus had prophesied that before the rooster crows, he would have denied him 3 times. And there he was, being questioned by the Pharisees in one of their temples or offices. And when the rooster had crowed, he looked directly at Peter. And Peter realized that he had denied him 3 times because Peter was afraid. I can't blame Peter because those times were dangerous. What you said, what you believed, what you did could cause death, your own death. And I really don't blame Peter, and I know that Jesus doesn't either. But Peter took it pretty hard. He left there running, and he wept bitterly. When the Jewish Pharisees had completed their questioning and decided that they were going to charge him with insurrection and a couple of other things, well, the guards then took over and they mocked him. They would blindfold him, and they would hit him, and they would slap him in the face, and they would ask him to prophesy, who hit you? And I can't say that the Roman guards didn't do anything worse. They did things worse. And I was part of that. And I will get to that a little bit later on. Well, Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate. The Pharisees, they wanted to kill Jesus because he claimed himself that he was the Son of God. He claimed divinity. And according to the Pharisees, this was blasphemous. But of course, they couldn't bring Jesus to Pilate with this kind of charge because it was more of a charge against their faith rather than a charge against the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was the nation, the one in charge at that time. I was part of it as a Roman soldier. So what they did to convince the Romans to kill him, to crucify him, the Pharisees made up 3 charges that were completely bogus. They were, first of all, his subversion to the nation. Secondly, his opposition to paying any form of taxes to Julius Caesar, who was the Roman emperor at the time. And of course, the third one, his claim to be Messiah or a king that would oppose the Roman emperor and therefore go back to the first charge of insurrection, leading a rebellion against the Roman Empire. Well, that would be enough for the Romans to listen. And then they would evaluate and charge him with those indictments or those charges and then bring him to crucifixion. Well, when Jesus was brought before Pilate, Pilate really didn't want to do anything with him. In fact, he found out that much of his ministry was in Galilee. So what Pilate did was that he sent him to Herod, who was in charge of the Galilean jurisdiction. Now, Herod was pleased to see Jesus. And so much so that because he had heard that Jesus had performed several miracles in Galilee, he wanted to see a miracle performed in front of him. And when Herod was trying to coax him into performing one of these miracles, Jesus did not want to play into this charade. So Herod simply sent him back to Pilate. He didn't want anything to do with him anymore. Again, Pilate didn't want to crucify Jesus and gave the Jewish people every single opportunity to spare him. So Pilate gave them an ultimatum. Pilate said either they let Barabbas free, a well-known insurrectionist and a murderer, or let this innocent man Jesus free. But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again. But they kept on shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him." But you know what? When you have the mob mentality, it's hard to stop it. And that's exactly what happened here with the Jewish nation, with these people who a week before were bringing him in as a king on what we celebrate, or what we as Christians celebrate as Palm Sunday. But now they were asking for his crucifixion. And they insisted and demanded that he be crucified. And their shouts prevailed because this is what Pilate decided to do. He granted, probably unwillingly, their demand. So he released the man that they wanted to be freed, right? This Barabbas, this insurrectionist, this murderer, and they kept Jesus there so that he could be crucified. This is where I come in as a first-person witness. You see, there is 3 of us. For a short time, for 6 months, I was on the crucifixion detail. I was in charge of the other 2. I was a little bit older and I had more experience with my posting in the northern region of the Roman Empire. These 2 others that were with me, they were new recruits. Now, crucifying a man is something that you will never forget. There are times that I wake up in the middle of the night and I remember the faces, I remember the cries, I remember the nakedness, I remember the pain, I remember so much. It's something that cannot be unseen. And here, I was going to crucify. Son of God. Of course, I didn't know it at the time. Well, we brought him in for what we call the warm-up. This is when they're whipped. This is when they're beat to an inch of their lives. But the minute I took possession of this man, there was something about him, something different. I couldn't quite put my hand on it. Yeah, I had heard he had done miracles, and I had heard that he had a wonderful teaching and ministry, and he had great integrity, he has great reputation. But all that aside, when I was in his presence, there was just something different about this man. But being a professional soldier of the Roman Empire, I couldn't let my feelings get in my way. I didn't really take part. Not that I'm denying that I had any part, but I did not take any part in the physical torture that they imposed, these 2 others imposed on this man. Jesus was whipped, not just with a leather whip, but they put metal barbs inside the whip so that they would go inside his skin. And they would literally have to pull the whip out of his skin. His skin was raw. There was hardly anything left that could be called human on the back of his body. He fell, and most of the criminals that we torture never get up. We have to force them up. Jesus got up in his own power. He took it all. He took every single lashing and every beating. The 2 men, knowing of his reputation, decided to mock him, just like the Jewish guards had done. So they got a crown of thorns and they put it on top of his head. They called him the King of the Jews. They called it to his face. They spit in his face. They slapped him. They mocked him. This King of Jews. When Jesus was this close to death, I told the guys to knock it off, that we would put him in prison overnight and he would be crucified the next day. We left him there. When I came back and saw Jesus lying there, I could barely recognize him. He was so swollen from the beating and the whipping and the mocking and the punches and all the other things that these 2 other men did to him. He was barely recognizable, never mind as Jesus Christ, the Son of God, but even as a man, he was hardly recognizable. Miraculously, he somehow got up to his feet when I asked him to. And there was a 200-pound weight of his cross that he had to take to Golgotha. He went about halfway. There was a crowd there. We had to play crowd control, make sure that people wouldn't hit him, that people wouldn't push him aside. But Jesus fell. And I knew at that point that he couldn't continue. So I got this man called Simon who took the cross. And he took it to the rest of the way. Jesus walked in his own power. And then we laid him down on the cross. There was no resistance. There was no fight. He did everything willingly. I had never seen anything like that. This was like no other man that I'd seen before. And we put those iron nails through his hands, through his feet. We tied him up to the cross and we lifted him. The crucifixion had begun. He was stripped of any clothing, just like the other two criminals that were crucified with him. It took some time. But sometime in the afternoon, that's when he cried his last breath. He cried to his Father and said, "To you, Father, I commit my spirit." And then he bowed his head and died. When his body was taken, it had to be buried. And there was this man called Joseph who was part of the council. He was a righteous man. He was one of the few who did not want to crucify Jesus Christ. And so he had spoken to Pilate and asked him to bury him because he had a tomb that was already prepared. He was a wealthy man that was already prepared for his family. And Pilate said, "Yes, go ahead, bury him under one stipulation. Because of all the controversy around this man, I want a large boulder to be rolled in front of the entrance to this tomb." And Joseph agreed. Well, my friends, that's the end of my story for this day. I'm going to be with you again Sunday morning to tell you the rest of my story. A story of joy, a story of redemption, and a story of hope. And I hope that you will join me on that day for one of the greatest stories that have ever been told. I am Tiberius, a soldier of the Roman Empire.